You are listening to another No Fair Remembering Stuff, the Tuesday edition of the Professional Left Podcast, and available wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, proleftpod.com, where you can also contribute to this podcast. There is a Patreon button at our website, or you can mail us a letter and or contribution at the Professional Left Podcast, P.O. Box 9133, Springfield, Illinois, 62791.
And it's not safe for work. And before we begin, happy anniversary to us, Driftglass.
Yes.
Our podcast media empire. The podcast is 14 years old this week. A surly teen, if ever there was one.
Doesn't want to hear anything from us. It doesn't. I think we're stupid and old, and we don't know what we're talking about. Leave us alone.
768 episodes. Actually, we're on 770 right now. This is 770. 21 episodes of our Science Fiction University, 3 presidential administrations, Driftglass.
Damn.
That's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And we will be having a bigger party for this in our Thursday show, because that is the Thursday show thing.
48 hours from now.
Yeah, 48 hours from now, we'll be recording another podcast. So we'll mention it again for now. Thank you so much for your support. Please keep supporting our podcast work, and we will keep doing the show.
Yeah, square deal. Today, we're going to look at the roots of a dance we call the conservative media four-step. It's very, very simple, and everybody knows the rules, which is really handy. In fact, reactionary fascist Chris Rufo was kind enough to say them out loud for the kids in the back.
This is from the newspaper The Harvard Crimson, January 27th, 2023, headline, "The Scholar Everyone Sought." Quote, "From the moment she finished her PhD nearly 25 years ago, Claudine Gay has been one of the most sought-after young scholars in the country. Trace her rise to Harvard's top post," unquote. So, target acquired, prominent Black intellectual, and bonus, she's a woman, going into a very powerful position.
Mm-hmm. And just FYI, this podcast is not going to be about Claudine Gay and Harvard. It just isn't. This is just the introductory period. So bear with us for a moment as we introduce the next step in the fourth step, which is turning a minor controversy into the greatest offense against the American bedrock standard of ethics the world had ever seen. This is from Christopher Rufo, December 19th, 2023. Quote, "We launched the Claudine Gay plagiarism story from the right. The next step is to smuggle it into the media apparatus of the left, legitimizing the narrative to the center-left actors who have the power to topple her. Then squeeze," unquote.
And step 3 of the fourth step is the payoff. Christopher F. Rufo, again, is the Wingnut Welfare Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And 2 days later, quote, "Breaking. The New York Times has just published a bombshell article analyzing 5 instances of Claudine Gay's plagiarism in depth, showing exactly how she lifted passages and violated the rules. This is damning. And coming from the left."
Yeah, it's not
unquote.
Me. It's the New York Times. It's not me. And sure enough, as day follows night, ABC News, Harvard University President Claudine Gay announced her resignation. Washington Post, Timeline, plagiarism allegations against Claudine Gay. Wall Street Journal, Claudine Gay is out as president. Where does Harvard go from here? USA Today, Claudine Gay resignation, what happened and why it matters. This was in The Hill. This was in the Los Angeles Times. This story was in the Times of Israel. And of course, it was everywhere, all over conservative media.
And then comes step 4, which is a very important step, the washing of the hands.
Mm-hmm.
From the New York Times, quote, 6 months and a swirl of controversy. The timeline of Claudine Gay's tenure as Harvard president, unquote. Hey, New York Times, wasn't it you who triggered and then amplified that swirl of controversy? With, more than a dozen columns and op-eds you fired off, obsessing over this? Journalistic time and energy and money that maybe, just maybe, could have been better spent on, say, the collection of raw Russian intelligence that mysteriously disappeared when Trump left the White House. How about those millions of dollars he got from foreign entities, including China?
You mean the impeachable things he did that violated the emoluments clause? They
All
should have been
that.
impeached for
All that.
all that. Yeah, I'm sure that was mentioned somewhere. I'm sure it got mentioned
It was,
somewhere.
but, we had the swirl of controversy to report that, was just out there in the air, Driftglass. Didn't have anything to do with Peter Baker of the New York Times having headlines and op-eds and stories and stuff.
Yeah. Eventually.
And so now we're going to break from the Claudine Gay story. And
eventually
OJ
will find the real murderer, honey. Eventually he will find the real murderer. Now, this was over our never Trump allies. Our allies, our good friends, our allies who are now on our side at the Bulwark, dined out on this bullshit as well. There was the Bulwark's Charlie Sykes podcast episode, Tom Nichols, Claudine Gay had to go, and the Bulwark's Mona Charen podcast episode, Harvard Schmarvard, and so on. Now, it's been said by people wiser than us that Harvard is, in fact, a hedge fund with a university attached. According to Wikipedia, so you know I'm not plagiarizing because I'm telling you it's from Wikipedia, the Harvard University endowment was valued at $49.444 billion with a B, billion dollars as of June 30th, 2022, and is the largest academic endowment in the world. Its value increased by over $10 billion in fiscal 2021 alone, ending the year with its largest sum in history.
Yeah, it's a hedge fund.
Just the amount of money.
It's a huge hedge fund. Yeah.
The art collection Harvard has is staggering. I mean, they're not wanting for anything. They're a nation unto themselves. They have more money. I looked it up the other day. I can't remember exactly. They have more money on hand than most small to medium-sized countries' annual GDPs.
That's right.
It's astonishing.
The combination of several countries' GDP is in one little plot of land in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Absolutely. And, full disclosure, I went to divinity school there. And the squirrels at Harvard, we always make that joke, they're all working off their grants. It's everything is funded there. So our question is, who cares? The person behind the big desk at Harvard Incorporated makes no material difference to the lives and fortunes of 99% of the citizens of the United States. But of course, it makes a huge difference to the readers of the New York Times that matter to the Schultzberger family.
Exactly.
And so why? I think this is the more important question. Why did this story swallow the news cycle for days on end while stories of actual material importance were ignored or at least set aside?
Yeah, or shoved to the back page. And this happened because conservatives like Rufo understand how the mainstream media works. They understand that the institutional media like the New York Times are not the guardians of truth. They are the Praetorian Guard of the Overton window. Their declarations that such and such is an important story makes that story important. That their declaration is what makes the story important, not the inherent importance of the story itself. And this story was like a shot of pure adrenaline straight to the heart of the punditocracy. It was a chance for a mob of clowns and thugs, all overpaid, to wrap themselves in self-righteousness and use a prominent black woman at a liberal institution as a piñata and call it a moral crusade. You need only look back at the epic mainstream media. Remember this, Blue Gal? But her emails sabotage of the Clinton campaign.
Yeah, I remember that.
Understand how this machinery works. Because I'll tell you what, back when he was ABC News chief political analyst, Matthew Dowd, ever heard of Matthew Dowd? Remember him? Understood this dynamic very well, very clearly. Whatever ginned up garbage the right throws into the hopper, the mainstream media Praetorian Guard of the Overton window must automatically treat it with as much seriousness as actual Republican crimes and scandals. This is from Matthew Dowd's since deleted tweet of November 1st, 2016. Remember, this is just before the election. Quote, either you care both about Trump being a sexual predator and Clinton emails, or you care about neither. But don't talk about one without the other, unquote. God damn. I mean, what a slime ball.
Or nothing. Yeah.
What a fucking slime ball. Yeah. So, step one, the right manufactures a scandal. It can literally be anything. Christmas cards, a solar energy company, flag pins, tan suits, pizza parlor, birth certificate. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all, since decades of conditioning not to believe anyone or anything that makes them feel bad. The reprogrammable zombies of the right will mob up for anything, right on cue.
Mm-hmm. Step 2, they keep hammering him away until the mainstream media opens the gates and lets the barbarians become their assignment editors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important to insert here that timing is important.
Yes.
We're going to talk a little bit about the beer summit. That's the main topic. That happened in midsummer.
Right.
And the Claudine Gay thing was over the holidays.
Mm-hmm.
It's when a lot of people are out. It's when there's the pressure to continue to have posts up or to have the front page full. And nobody's working. Everyone's on vacation. So you have less experienced people working. All of that is to the advantage of whoever is pushing an agenda.
And you also pointed out when we talked about this that they don't need to keep hammering away terribly hard anymore. The barbarians are now basically the assignment editors all the time for all major news.
Because the idea is to get something out on the web as quickly as possible. Make sure you have something every 15 minutes going out the door. And so if someone can provide you with a story that's pretty much done. I mean, I found this out with you working with the local newspaper. Look, if somebody hands us rip and print press conference news release, we're just going to print it.
Yeah.
Because we don't have time. We don't have people. We don't have time.
That's
so if you give us something that's ready to go, we're going to take it and use it. Yeah.
Right down the street from us is the Illinois Policy Institute, the right wing.
That's their whole thing.
That funded tobacco research, anti-climate research, pro-oil research, and a quote-unquote libertarian think tank, and they have the money to do that sort of thing.
That so the newspapers don't have these days. Right. The hedge funds have squeezed them out of any funding, and so all the actual content comes from people who have the money to fund content. Yeah. And then step 3, the mainstream media proves how not liberal they are to their barbarian assignment editors by swarm attacking the new target, hand-selected by that very barbarian of the right. This is from Vox, November 4th, 2016, just days before Trump's election. Quote, network newscasts have remarkably dedicated more airtime to coverage of Clinton's emails than to all policy issues combined. Cable news has been, if anything, worse, and many prestige outlets have joined the pile-up. One malign result of obsessive email coverage is that the public is left totally unaware of the policy stakes in the election. Another is that the constant vague recitations of the phrase Clinton email scandal have firmly implanted the notion that there is something scandalous about anything involving Hillary Clinton and email, including her campaign manager getting hacked, or the revelation that one of her aides sometimes checked email on her husband's computer. Unquote. This also from Vox, December 7th, 2017, a year later. Quote, Hillary Clinton's emails got as much front page coverage in 6 days as policy did in 69 days.
Jesus.
A stark finding from an analysis. This is just the New York Times. They failed this country.
Oh, absolutely.
The hand-wringing over the 2016 election continues more than a year later. Fake news, Russia collusion, James Comey, Wisconsin. But 2 researchers, David Rothschild and Duncan Watts, took an in-depth analysis of the mainstream media that will add to the 2016 debate. Their findings, published in the Columbia Journalism Review, focus on the New York Times election coverage. Their starkest discovery, quote, in just 6 days, the New York Times ran as many cover stories about Hillary Clinton's emails as they did about all the policy issues combined in the 69 days leading up to the election, unquote.
Such a failure. I mean, such an epic, obvious Iraq war level failure. So how do they deal with it? Well, that's how we've arrived at step 4, which is after the conflagration, you wash your hands. And this time it took the form of, we're just doing our job. This is from Business Insider, February 19th, 2022. New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet says he doesn't regret the newspaper's 2016 Hillary Clinton email coverage, unquote. Nope. We did a good job. We wrote about Trump. I mean, we did our stuff. What are you bitching about? And that's why the New York Times is the way it is now, because there's no way. Dean Baquet doesn't work there anymore.
Right.
But there's no way to reach people like that and talk to them about the fact that they are destroying democracy. They don't care, or they live on the Acela corridor with David Brooks and the Harvard University elite, and the rest of us just don't exist as far as they're concerned.
Right. So when something happens at Harvard,
it's big news.
Then it's big news. And let's face it. I mean, Claudine Gay, her testimony in front of a Republican congressional committee, it was a mistake for her to even show up for that.
She should have Jordaned it.
Maybe college presidents will have learned their lesson that if Republicans are in charge of a committee, don't show up.
No, tell them to fuck off. Tell them to come to the cathedral and make you come.
And you'll submit your answers in writing. Yeah.
With footnotes.
With footnotes, right. Mm-hmm. So where did the right get the idea that they could just bully and head fake the establishment media into accepting their inflation of minor stories into giant scandals? Well, that dynamic goes all the way back to the Reagan administration, gets worse with Bush the Elder, much, much worse with Gingrich, Limbaugh, and Richard Mellon's Scaife's Arkansas project during the Clinton administration, until the whole thing was finally superheated by Bush the Younger's Iraq debacle. Fake terrorist warnings. Remember the chart, Driftglass?
Oh, yeah.
With the terror chart?
Whenever his ratings went down or an election was near, those
went up to orange.
Went up.
It always went up to orange,
Weird how that worked,
And all the rest of it to the point where it all boiled over onto the stove and burned down the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. W left the Republican Party in ruins. There were massive deficits, 2 failed wars, one of which Bush had clearly lied us into, a collapsed economy, a major American city destroyed by a hurricane, and by Bush administration criminal incompetence. A massive expose of the secret torture policies of the Bush regime. And on and on and on. It was time for the stunned, demoralized, and completely discredited Republican base to sit down, shut up, and let the new Democratic president go about the business of cleaning up all the disasters that Bush had left behind. Or so you would think. But nope.
Nope. That is exactly what should have happened. That's exactly what the American people voted for, and that did not happen. Now, at first, Republican leadership were, in fact, a little bit cautious about exactly what to do about Barack Obama. They had already met at the Caucus Room restaurant to map out a plan of unremitting legislative sabotage. But on the other hand, Obama was actually genuinely popular. He'd won the 2008 election in as close to a landslide as we ever get these days. He was calm. He was confident. He was cool, actually cool. He was a cool guy. He was articulate. And he had been very carefully courting the good opinion of conservative elites. This is from The New Yorker, January 22nd, 2012. Quote, on a frigid January evening in 2009, a week before his inauguration, Barack Obama had dinner at the home of George Will, the Washington Post columnist who had assembled a number of right-leaning journalists to meet the president-elect. Accepting such an invitation was a gesture on Obama's part that signaled his desire to project an image of himself as a post-ideological politician, a Chicago Democrat eager to forge alliances with conservative Republicans on the Hill. That week, Obama was still working on an inaugural address that would call for, quote, an end to the petty grievances and false promises, the recriminations and worn-out dogmas that for far too long have strangled our politics, unquote. Hey, I'm all for that too. Obama sprang coatless from his limousine and headed up the steps to Will's yellow clapboard house. He was greeted by Will, and get these names, Blue Gal, Michael Barone, David Brooks, Charles Krauthammer, William Crystal, Lawrence Kudlow, Rich Lowry, and yes, Peggy Noonan. No word on how drunk she was at the time. Yeah. Now, they were, as the article continues, they were Reaganites all, yet some had paid tribute to Obama during the campaign. Lowry, who is the editor of the National Review, called Obama, quote, the only presidential candidate from either party about whom there is a palpable excitement. Krauthammer, an intellectual and ornery voice on Fox News and on the pages of the Washington Post, had written that Obama would be, quote, a president with the political intelligence of a Bill Clinton, harnessed to the steely self-discipline of a Vladimir Putin, who would, quote, bestride the political stage as largely as did Reagan. Over dinner, Obama searched for points of common ground. He noted that he and Kudlow agreed on a business investment tax cut. Quote, he loves to deal with both sides of the issue, Kudlow later wrote. He revels in the back and forth, and he wants to keep the dialogue going with conservatives, unquote. And this was to be his biggest strategic mistake.
Because while Barack Obama was popular and in every way the opposite of the Republican gang of liars, criminals, and idiots who had left the White House behind with nothing but failure and rubble to show for it, and while the Republican base was decimated and demoralized, they were all still Republicans. However polite these Beltway conservative pundits may be over drinks and canapes at George Will's house, by January 2009, the real Republican Party, the GOP base, and the conservative media had already irrevocably committed itself to the path that would lead to Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
They had already begun pushing the Bush years down the memory hole and morphing themselves into the fake Tea Party. And at the first sign of weakness, the knives would come out and stay out. As Mickey Rourke says in Iron Man 2, if you make God bleed, people will stop believing in him. There will be blood in the water and the sharks will come. And that first sign of weakness came on July 22nd, 2009, at the very end of an hour-long press conference that was mostly about health care. Remember those? Here is how Obama opened that press conference.
Before I take your questions, I want to talk for a few minutes about the progress we're making on health insurance reform and where it fits into our broader economic strategy. This is about every family, every business, and every taxpayer who continues to shoulder the burden of a problem that Washington has failed to solve for decades. This debate is not a game for these Americans, and they can't afford to wait any longer for reform. They're counting on us to get this done. They're looking to us for leadership, and we can't let them down. We will pass reform that lowers cost, promotes choice, and provides coverage that every American can count on. And we will do it this year.
Then Obama called at the end of the press conference on Lynn Sweet, a Chicago reporter who Obama knew from his days in the Illinois state legislature. Listen to how careful and considered his answer was. He goes out of his way to qualify what he is saying based on the limited amount he knows about the incident, and that Skip Gates, who was the person arrested in this story, is his personal friend.
Recently, Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. was arrested at his home in Cambridge. What does that incident say to you, and what does it say about race relations in America?
Well, I should say at the outset that Skip Gates is a friend, so I may be a little biased here. I don't know all the facts. What's been reported, though, is that the guy forgot his keys, jimmied his way to get into the house. There was a report called into the police station that there might be a burglary taking place. So far, so good, right? I mean, if I was trying to jigger into, well, I guess this is my house now, so it probably wouldn't happen. But let's say my old house in Chicago. Here I'd get shot. But so far, so good. They're reporting. The police are doing what they should. There's a call. They go investigate what happens. My understanding is, at that point, Professor Gates is already in his house. The police officer comes in. I'm sure there's some exchange of words, but my understanding is that Professor Gates then shows his ID to show that this is his house. And at that point, he gets arrested for disorderly conduct, charges which are later dropped. Now, I don't know, not having been there and not seeing all the facts, what role race played in that, but I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home. And number three, what I think we know separate and apart from this incident is that there is a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately.
So you can hear it, right? There's no swearing, there's no screaming, there's no telling people to rot in hell, there's no calling his enemies monsters or lunatics or bastards. There's no crucifying of the police generally. It's all very measured and very careful. And for the rest of the media, for about 12 hours, the obvious story to come out of the press conference was healthcare, right? That's what the press conference was about. This is from ABC. July 22nd, 2009. Quote, Obama says healthcare reform can't wait. President says politics could obscure real suffering of healthcare status quo, unquote. But this was not the case in the conservative media. Instead, conservative media went instantly ballistic over Obama's innocuous comment about the arrest of Henry Louis Gates. This is from Fox News, July 23rd, 2009. Quote, Cambridge police officer to Obama, "Butt out of my arrest," unquote. Fox News, July 24th, 2009. One day later, quote, disgraceful. Cops angry after Obama slams arrest of black scholar. Many police officers across the country have a message for President Barack Obama. Get all the facts before criticizing one of our own. Obama's public criticism that Cambridge officers, quote, acted stupidly, unquote, when they arrested black Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., could make it harder for police to work with people of color. Some police officers said Thursday it could even set back the progress of race relations that helped Obama become the nation's first African-American president, they said, unquote. Fox News from the same day, quote, Obama tackles messy racial issue after steering clear as a candidate, unquote. See, Blue Gal? He fooled the liberal media like you and me by pretending to not care about race to get elected. But we here at Fox News were not fooled. We knew this guy had a secret black militant agenda, and here it is. Here it comes. It's coming to get you. And just like that, this became the story, and not the 55-minute of detailed healthcare policy Q&A that had preceded it.
Yeah, it was almost an hour of detailed. If you go back and listen to that press conference, it gets kind of boring.
Yeah.
Because he's talking about healthcare policy very specifically and talking about how he's going to go visit Cleveland Clinic. And that's the entire story of the press conference. It's an offhand remark with one word, stupidly, in that entire press conference that Fox News gloms onto.
And that press conference, again, I urge everyone to listen to the whole thing because it's wonderful. A reporter gets up and says, well, what about this study that I think the Mayo Clinic did about thus and so? And Obama says, well, yes, I'm familiar with that study, but they did further study on the subject. And if you look at their blog, which I've read, here are the results of their further study that support my position. He was loaded for bear. He had all the facts. And that's why they couldn't take him on healthcare. They had to find something else to talk about. And they found it.
And just like that, this became the story. And it became the story not just at Fox.
Nope.
From ABC News, Obama defends criticism of Cambridge police in arrest of Gates.
This is from the New York Times. Obama criticizes arrest of Harvard professor.
From CBS News, Obama, cops acted stupidly in professor's arrest.
From CBS again, Cambridge cops want Obama apology.
New York Magazine, Cambridge police demand that Obama apologize, exclamation point.
From Reuters, Obama, police acted stupidly arresting black scholar. And so, less than a week later, on July 28th, 2009, you have the highest rated person on cable TV, Glenn Beck, interviewed on Fox and Friends, being perfectly comfortable saying garbage like this.
The White House are going to have a beer fest.
Is unbelievable.
Why?
That is why?
Yeah, why?
For a teaching lesson, some sort of a who needs to learn what here? This president, I think, has exposed himself as a guy over and over and over again who has a deep-seated hatred for white people or the white culture. I don't know what it is, but you can't sit in a pew with Jeremiah Wright for 20 years and not hear some of that stuff and not have it wash over. What kind of president of the United States immediately jumps on the police, just like what kind of president would ever say, oh, well, yeah, well, he's black. Of course he was breaking into the house. You'd never do that. You'd never do that. Right. He wanted to address this. Now they're going to have a beer? That's obscene.
It seems weird to me that he wanted to perpetuate the story.
That's from Crooks and Liars, by the way.
Yeah. Way to go, Crooks and Liars. So Obama is there trying to get health care done and feels he has to do damage control, right? He invited the arresting officer, Sergeant Crowley of the Cambridge, Massachusetts Police Department, and his friend Skip Gates to the White House for a beer.
Now, the most interesting account of what happened at the beer summit, unsurprisingly, is from the historian Henry Louis Gates Jr., interviewed by New York Times Magazine all the way in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not gonna read the whole interview to you, but the points that Gates makes about, this dumbass arrested me, which was dumb. But it goes deeper than that. And this is the part we want to share with you. New York Times Magazine asked Gates, was conciliatory thinking along the lines of racists aren't ready for that in your head in 2009 when you were dealing with the incident with the Cambridge police? Oh, yeah, says Gates. President Obama made an innocent comment that the arrest was stupid, which it was. Then, all of a sudden, all these racists are beating up on him. My whole attitude was channeled through the desire to protect our first black president. But there was another motivation. I thought it would be hubristic and dishonest if I compared what happened to me to what happens to black people in the inner city. I thought if I didn't have the protections of class and status, the outcome would have been very different, says the New York Times Magazine. Right, says Gates. When the policeman, Sergeant Crowley, and I met, I said, why did you arrest me? He said, I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to go home to my wife because I was convinced that your partner was upstairs and he was going to come down and blow me away. And it turns out that Gates, had jimmied the lock in his house, had suitcases in the hallway, which it also turns out is how some burglars break into houses and steal stuff. They walk out with suitcases.
Mm-hmm.
And so then Gates tells the New York Times Magazine, so the officer saw a black face. He saw the suitcases. That's part of a profile. It's what they call an already read text. He couldn't hear me or see me. Well, that might be related to police excesses and abuses, but it's a far end of the scale. And I was able to reverse what happened to me, unlike an Eric Garner. So my whole reaction to my arrest was determined by two things: the attacks on President Obama and my own determination not to claim too much for my own victimization. I also want to add that later on in this interview, they talk about why Biden was at the table at the beer summit.
Right.
And it was because the cops insisted that it not be two black guys talking to one white cop.
Right.
They had brought another white guy to be at the table. And however it worked out, the White House said, no, you're not going to have two cops talking to two black guys. We'll have Biden sit in.
Yeah, Biden. He's up for a beer.
The other little detail that's kind of funny is that Barack Obama drank a Bud Light.
Yeah.
Which, is way before the whole trans people drink Bud Light,
well,
quote unquote controversy, another right-wing freak out.
I also want to compliment you on the research you did digging this thing out. That was really impressive. And there's another part. It's a much longer article, but how carefully the White House wanted to stage manage this thing.
Oh, yeah.
They said to Gates, you cannot come in on a private plane. Well, that's how no, you can't do it. You can't wear any bespoke suits. So that's all I've got.
And Gates was mad at that point. I'm not going to go to Sears and Roebuck and buy a suit. I only have custom-made suits.
Yeah, but you can't wear them.
Because he's rich.
He's rich. It's all about, my friend at Martha's Vineyard, we talked this thing over and the summer I spent with Michael Bloomberg and how Michael Bloomberg would make a great president. I know him personally. I think he's got guts. He's aware of his privilege. He's perfectly
absolutely
aware.
Yeah.
But the White House is very much trying to say this is a distraction. We need to stage manage this thing where we can't make this about class, about the rich guy versus the poor guy, the white collar guy versus the blue collar guy. Just wear the costume, say the lines, and all this will. And
let's have the photo op and be done with it.
Exactly.
Make peace.
Mm-hmm.
So the beer summit kept the media busy for a week or so during the end of summer doldrums in 2009. Instead of talking about health care, the Obama White House attempted to soothe the fake outrage over one word at the end of an hour-long press conference on health care.
Yep. And the conservative media four-step would dominate the remainder of the Obama presidency. Again and again, the right would pick some target to destroy, ideally a person of color or a woman or both, exaggerate a nothing story or just an outright lie into the greatest offense against America's bedrock standard of ethics the world had ever seen, then use every conservative media outlet and voice to loudly complain that the mainstream media refuses to cover this important story because they're so goddamn liberal, until the mainstream media capitulates, and then dropping that distraction once the target had been destroyed and moving on to the next one and the next one and the next one.
Right. In September of 2009, now this is just 2 months later, the new target was Van Jones. From Politico, the White House announced that its green job czar, Van Jones, would resign after fierce criticism from Republicans about some of his statements and associations prior to joining the administration. You mean he'd been a black activist? Really?
Yeah.
And I'm not a crazy Van Jones fan.
No.
But they picked him.
For that reason.
And looked at it and researched his background and found stuff. And I want to take a minute, Driftglass, and have you talk about applying to work in the Obama White House in 2008.
Okay. So in 2008, I'm unemployed, living in Chicago. The Obama global headquarters is in Chicago, right?
Right.
It's 2 miles from my house. I know right where it is. And they're looking for people. And I have 10 years of experience with workforce development. I had met Barack Obama on several occasions personally. I had been
worked for the city of Chicago. I mean, you had government experience.
Oh, yeah. I had government experience in exactly what the Obama administration was looking for. It was, manufacturing, education, public-private partnerships, finding funding, reforming school education to comport with the needs of the marketplace, all that bullshit. That's on my resume. And that was all verifiable and recent. And we had briefed Senate delegations. We'd gone to Washington and briefed the Kennedy people. We'd briefed the Obama people. We were not crackpots coming in from left field. We were from Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
We had the experience they were looking for. And so I downloaded the PDF that was the application to work for the Obama White House. And I thought, well, okay, I need a job. Why not go work for the President of the United States? That's a great idea. And plus, as I said, we'd met before. I was part of the team that vetted him for the Independent Voters of Illinois back when he was running for Congress. So remember Barack? Remember me? Remember your pal? Remember your pal Driftglass? So you had to fill out an application. And part of it was, have you ever said, I'm quoting from memory now, so I might get this wrong. Have you ever said anything controversial or derogatory or in any way defamatory or in any way shrill on any blog posts or comments or emails? Basically, have you ever said or done anything ever in print, in any medium, of any kind that might potentially come back to bite this president on the ass? Now, at that point, I knew these people are never going to hire Driftglass, the blogger, ever. That's never going to happen. So,
and that meant here's why I wanted you to bring that up. That meant that the kind of person that they hired was going to be from the beginning of their lives career oriented.
Yep. Careful.
And also non-confrontational.
Yeah.
Because they had never commented on a blog and said, you're full of shit.
And
they'd never fought in the trenches that way.
No.
And that doesn't mean they did put Rahm Emanuel as chief of staff. I mean, that was the other thing that was hilarious about this whole thing, right? Like, there's a
level above the hiring of staff that Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod go to, who are profound swearers and have notorious for that sort of thing. But for the rank and file people who are going to serve the administration, they wanted people who were mostly educated at the Ivies and had a background in some policy depth in something they were interested in doing, and had a pristine record of never saying or doing anything that pissed anybody off. And
which I think meant that there weren't enough fighters in the White House.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
There just weren't. And so the next target was the community organizing and advocacy group Acorn.
Yeah, this is from Dissent Magazine, October 27th, 2010. Quote, in 2008, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, Acorn, and its extended family of related organizations had a combined budget of more than $100 million, a staff of more than 1,000, and a membership of more than 400,000. By the end of January of 2010, Acorn had ceased to exist as a national organization. As a brief aside, that's how effective the Republican strategy of destroying anyone that stands in their way was, because they have no rules. There's no limits on what they're willing to do. Back to the article. Despite Acorn's exemplary record on voter registration, right-wing opponents, often quoted in the mainstream press, kept referring to criminal charges and criminal investigations. A pattern was setting in. Right-wingers denounced Acorn with reckless and inaccurate charges, Fox News would report the smears and add lies of its own. The mainstream media would start to treat the fact of the accusations as news without fact-checking the actual claims made against Acorn. Major liberal politicians, many of whom benefited from Acorn's voter mobilization campaigns, remained silent. Lacking a nationally recognized spokesperson, Acorn just didn't make it onto the Rolodex for most national news organizations. False charges of criminal activity were repeated without rebuttal. After the presidential election, this pattern of false charges without rebuttal was repeated with a new and entirely manufactured scandal. Andrew Breitbart, a right-wing blogger who would, in 2010, seek to defame a Department of Agriculture official named Shirley Sherrod as a black racist, released shocking video of Acorn staff offering advice to a couple posing as a pimp and a prostitute. Take it away, Blue Gal.
Yeah, continuing with the Dissent magazine article. Every television viewer knows that James O'Keefe entered Acorn offices dressed in an outrageously flamboyant pimp outfit to seek his advice. Even the New York Times reported as fact that O'Keefe dressed as a pimp and entered Acorn offices. He did dress as a pimp for his video, and he did enter Acorn offices, but at different times. During his actual visits to Acorn offices, he dressed very conventionally. His hidden video camera shows low-level Acorn staff responding sympathetically to him and alleged prostitute Hannah Giles. Clearly, some Acorn staffers said some dumb things in seeking to offer support to Giles and O'Keefe. But because O'Keefe and Breitbart refused to release the original unedited tapes, we don't know the context of the conversations, and no one checked.
Nope.
Unquote.
The conservative slander on Acorn was so effective that by November of 2009, get this, 52% of Republicans polled by Public Policy Polling say they believe Acorn stole the presidential election for Barack Obama. And you wonder why we call them reprogrammable meatbags.
Yeah. And why they're so susceptible to the idea that the elections are rigged. Because anytime a Democrat is elected, the elections are rigged.
Absolutely. And this whole idea that these thugs and criminals and liars and perverts and bottom feeders are wrapping themselves in this self-righteous language. And Acorn let some people in the door, and here's a little bit of video, and we need to take down the whole organization. This is so reminiscent of Clinton, where even the appearance of impropriety, Blue Gal, should be enough to impeach the president of the United States.
Right.
And then you find out these people are the worst scum in the world. They're just they're worse than any charge they've ever brought against any Democrat.
And
ever.
we have 93 indictments, and it's nothing.
Nothing
For
they don't
Trump.
care.
You know, doesn't matter. Right. After the whole Acorn thing, the next target was Shirley Sherrod, in which flagrantly doctored video, once again from James O'Keefe and his Project Veritas, led to the White House firing Shirley Sherrod on the spot on July 19th, 2010.
Yep. And as we said, this is where Barack Obama made his fatal strategic error. He really thought there were deals to be had with Republicans on the country's most pressing issues, and he had deluded himself into believing that those urbane, coastal, conservative pundits sipping gin rickies and talking about Reinhold Niebuhr at George Will's house were in any way representative of the actual Republican Party. They were not. Those are not real Republicans, Barack Obama. Get out of the house. Get out of it now. The real Republican Party was a slag heap of bigots and imbeciles who hated his guts and believed every scary thing they ever heard about him from the liars on Fox News. They believed he had rigged up death panels to kill their sainted white mothers. They believed he was very likely a Kenyan communist sleeper cell and maybe even gay. And the real representatives of the real Republican Party had already met to plot Obama's demise at the Caucus Room restaurant on the very day Barack Obama was inaugurated president.
This is from James Wolcott and Vanity Fair, April 27th, 2012. During a lengthy discussion, the senior GOP members worked out a plan to repeatedly block Obama over the coming 4 years to try to ensure he would not be reelected. In his book, Do Not Ask What Good We Do Inside the U.S. House of Representatives, Robert Draper opens with the heady atmosphere in Washington on the days running up to the inauguration and the day itself, which attracted 1.8 million people to the mall to witness Obama being sworn in as America's first black president. Those numbers contributed to a growing sense of unease among Republicans, as much the defeat in the White House race the previous November. The 15 Republicans were in a somber mood as they gathered at the caucus room in Washington, an upscale restaurant where a New York strip steak costs $51, strip class.
Damn you, Biden, and your inflation. Damn it. Mm-hmm.
Attending the dinner were House members Eric Cantor, Jeb Hensarling, yes, Pete Hoekstra, Dan Lundgren, Kevin McCarthy, Paul Ryan, and Pete Sessions.
Oh, all the young guns were there.
All the young guns were there. From the Senate were Tom Coburn, Bob Corker, Jim DeMint, John Ensign, and John Kyle. Others present were former House Speaker and future and failed presidential candidate Newt Gingrich, and the Republican strategist Frank Luntz, who organized the dinner and sent out the invitations. If you act like you're the minority, you're going to stay in the minority, said Kevin McCarthy. Wow.
I know.
Quoted by Draper, we've got to challenge them on every single bill and challenge them on every single campaign. The Republicans have done that, bringing Washington to a near standstill several times during Obama's first term over debt and other issues, unquote. They shut down the government.
Yep, and they filibustered their own bills to stop Obama from
having any accomplishments. Mm-hmm. This last bit is priceless. Remember, this was Wolcott in Vanity Fair 12 years ago. Quote, I still hear Frank Luntz ID'd on cable news as a pollster, as if all he does is gather and interpret data. So let's stop with that wormy pretense. And could we get a moratorium on the both sides do it refrain from cognitive impaired columnists, talk show hosts, pundits, and editorial writers? Oh, who am I kidding? Broderism lives on in the Beltway and beyond, even if David Broder himself is no longer among us, unquote. 12 years.
12 years
of
ago.
Both-siderist bullshit in class.
12 years ago, James Wolcott was identifying that as probably the number one cause for the reason our media was falling apart. So there is a very good case to be made that July 23rd, 2009 was the moment that Obama made the fatal strategic error that caused his administration to lose all of its forward momentum. Obama wanted to talk about health care, right? That's very, very clear. Republicans did not want to talk about health care. So suddenly, Obama's careful, factual, innocuous comment becomes angry black man says police are racist monsters. So, okay, fine, whatever. We'll do a beer thing. We'll put this distraction behind us so we can get back to important matters of state, right? Because the problem with that thinking is that the actual leaders of the Republican Party, have and had no interest in important matters of state at all. Getting Obama to flinch was the point. And once they found they could roll him, firing off one distraction after another, nonstop, rapid fire to keep him distracted and keep him on his back foot became the Republican strategy for the next 8 years. Like the very dubious broken window theory of crime prevention, once Republicans found they could make Obama break his stride and respond to some trivial bullshit, and that the mainstream media would go along with it, they immediately began escalating, and they have never stopped. By September of 2009, Republicans were feeling cocky enough and understood that their racist base wanted well enough that Republican Joe Wilson could stand up during the middle of a presidential address to a joint session of Congress and shout, "You lie!" and be pretty confident that he'd not only get away with it, but be applauded for it and could raise money off of it. It's true there was a toothless official rebuke that was passed along party lines, but
the resolution of disapproval is essentially a slap on the wrist. But back in his conservative home district, Wilson is getting pats on the back, along with hundreds of thousands of dollars in new campaign contributions.
And this is where Blue Gal and I differ slightly about the long-term effects all this had on the legacy of the Obama administration. And if I'm misquoting you, Blue Gal, or misciting you, you tell me, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Blue Gal thinks that being the first black president was history-making enough. And that by
and I would add to that, in addition to being the first black president, passing health care reform.
Yes.
Which he did do by the skin of his teeth.
By the skin of his teeth.
With one Senate seat from Minnesota. He was able to pass health care reform. Yeah.
And by jettisoning from the package a lot of the things that he wanted and that I wanted and that he'd promised on the campaign trail to get Joe Lieberman to go along with it, to get Joe Lieberman's knife out of his back. All true.
Yeah.
And that by virtue of the Congress and the country and the media he had to deal with at the time, he did about as well as the first black president could possibly ever have done. Okay? Fair enough. In the January-February 2017 issue of The Atlantic, author Ta-Nehisi Coates looked back on Obama's time as the nation's first black president and said this, quote, "For 8 years, Barack Obama walked on ice and never fell," unquote, which is undeniably true, and only a damn idiot would argue about race and culture and legacy with Ta-Nehisi Coates. So I'm not going to do that because I'm not that stupid. I agree with what he says. However, I think it is also true that Barack Obama believed he'd been elected at a time when the nation was in deep, deep trouble, and that he'd been elected to accomplish important things. However, I think it's also true that the minute he let momentum slip away, accomplishing almost anything became almost impossible. And I'll just leave you with this, Blue Gal. As you know, at the end of his life, Harlan Ellison and I struck up kind of a phone friendship. I was his guy in Chicago, and he would call me. I was working at the Safer Foundation at the time, and I'd be in a meeting, and I'd get someone would come and say, "There's a guy named Harlan Ellison on the phone," or he'd call my cell phone. So, excuse me, guys, I got to go take a call. So Harlan Ellison and I would talk on the phone, once a week or once every couple of weeks. And his opinion was he liked Obama. He was proud of Obama. He thought he was way too smart for the room, and he thought he was way too nice a guy to get this job done. They didn't have the killer instinct you need. Said the fuckers he's up against are evil. They're evil motherfuckers. They've been evil motherfuckers since Reagan, since Nixon, since Goldwater. And he has got to get in there with a sword. This is not me quoting him directly now, but basically with a sword in both hands and cut these fuckers to bits. And he does not have the internal machinery to do that. He loves to compromise. He loves to conciliate. He loves to negotiate. That's what he's good at. These people look at all of those virtues as weaknesses, and he's not up for this job because the job that we need done is to destroy the Republican Party, and he's just not going to do that. And I have to agree.
Okay, so I'm going to insert into this something that Keith Olbermann said on this morning's podcast, because we listen to that every day that he's on, about Keith Olbermann saying what he thought about the Iraq War.
Right.
Before other people said it.
Yeah.
And that John Kerry met up with Keith Olbermann at a baseball game and said, "Thank you," basically for breaking the wall.
Yeah.
So that we Democrats could walk through the break in the wall that you made and speak the truth about Iraq.
Right.
Because otherwise we were siding with the traitor. We were siding with the terrorists. But you pointing out, no, they're lying to us. The White House is lying to us. Broke that mesmerism and broke that wall so that we could also go through and walk through it. And I think about that, and I think about Barack Obama and Jon Stewart, and how Jon Stewart was relentless against Fox and called Fox. And I know to the point of being irritating, because you said he just points to Fox and says bullshit mountain all day, every night.
Well, I was irritated to the point of because that's what the news should be doing. That's the actual news should be doing.
But the news doesn't do that, right?
Exactly.
That's the failure. That's where the failure is.
Exactly.
And this is what angers me, and I think campaign Biden is starting to get it by calling Trump a loser all the time. He's clearly got very good political instincts and anger instincts and killer instincts, but there is also the fact of being presidential and not saying, by the way, over on bullshit mountain.
Right.
Which is what you and I would like to hear the president say. Whoever the Democratic presidents say, these fuckers, are going to Newsmax for their news and thinking they're watching Walter Cronkite. What kind of a mental institution do you have to be in to open your skull and let Sean Hannity shit in your head and call it news? I mean, that's what we would like to hear. That's what we say, right? But there is something about being presidential and holding that office that, you are working toward history and your place on that president's placemat, right?
I'd like to add two things to that.
Yeah, I want to talk about this.
First thing is, the second thing, this is the eidetic memory that we both have. The second thing that Keith Olbermann said this morning on the podcast about John Kerry was, he turned to John Kerry and said, "Isn't that your job? Shouldn't you be doing that?" And John Kerry says, "Yeah, that's the way it should be, but that's not the way it is."
That's not the way it is. No.
Tough. That's tough.
And,
Sorry.
And so, yes, it irritates me no end that Joe Biden is distinguishing MAGA Republicans from Republicans.
Yeah, when there's no distinction.
When there's no distinction.
I would add a second. Let me add a second thing, though, before I agree with you. The second thing is, yeah, being presidential is doing all that. Being presidential is also Roosevelt saying, and I understand their hatred and I welcome it.
I welcome their hatred. Yeah.
You know, Roosevelt was the model Democratic president for all his flaws. Yeah. And he took a fucking sword to the Republican Party.
Yes,
he did not pull any punches. So you can be presidential, but at the same time, you can mention the fact that the other party has lost its fucking mind without saying fuck it.
And that there are a bunch of, I want to send $1 to the Biden administration, the Biden campaign, every time he uses the word white nationalist. Yes. He said that in the context of the South Carolina church, where, you know, Black people were murdered for praying and using Bible study.
Yep.
You know, he could say white nationalism there, but he needs to go to Philadelphia and Detroit and Atlanta and say white nationalism, white nationalism, white nationalism.
Yes, he does.
And that needs to be the story of what the Republican Party has become.
Yeah. And he can.
And if you're a Republican, you are a fucking racist.
Yes.
If you are voting Republican in 2024, you're a fucking racist.
And we can say that, but he can say that without the F word.
Yeah, he can.
And he can. And he should. And
but he's saying MAGA Republicans instead.
Oh, I know. But all he's shooting for right now is to win enough swing states to stay in the White House.
He just needs 270. Right. He needs 271. And Trump is over.
The larger project is to bury that toxic party and salt the earth where it once stood. Yeah. And something else will rise from it, and then we'll deal with that, or our children will, or our grandchildren will. Yeah. But for now,
provided that the climate doesn't kill us all.
Right. I mean, there's always a large world-destroying crisis around the corner, and that one's very real.
Yeah.
But for now, I think we can agree that Barack Obama had many virtues. If Barack Obama were on the ticket now, I'd vote for him again.
Yeah.
Without hesitation. I think he actually, towards the end of his second term or middle of his second term, he learned his lesson.
Oh, yeah.
And he really did start to wake up to the fact that these people aren't messing and I shouldn't mess either. Yeah. That was when David Brooks broke down and had a hysterical crying fit in the New York Times about being a sap. Mm-hmm. Why was he a sap? Because Barack Obama promised to run as a nonpartisan, blah, blah, and be in the center, blah,
and
blah.
your party were bullshit artists for 6 years.
Which you wouldn't talk about. Which you would not
talk about.
It was all, remember, this is all this being nice and being negotiating and being centrist and never raising a fist and never raising your voice is all predicated on the lie that Republicans have no control over themselves. They can't be held responsible for any of this. They can't be expected to beat you halfway because they're all fucking monsters. But that's the fact that no person in the media will mention. Kristen Welker didn't talk about it on Meet the Press yesterday, and they will never talk about it in the press as long as you and I are alive. So that's up to us. It's up to us to insert the F-bomb into the sentences that Joe Biden can't. Now, don't forget, Blue Gal, we really need more Patreons to make this podcast fly.
We do. So we need your Patreon support.
We want to get to 770. We really do. And we think we can do it. So if you can spare $5, please spare $5. I'm going to need it for cough medicine or cough drops or something. And visit our Patreon at patreon.com/ProLeftPod. And thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you for doing that. See you next time.
See you next time.
The Professional Left podcast, No Fair Remembering Stuff Tuesday edition, is recorded under a Creative Commons license. Copyright 2024-25 DGBG Productions.